All right, today we're looking at women and the Civil War and what roles they played in various aspects of the war itself. Much like the Revolutionary War, they had to provide a lot of support to the soldiers. So I guess we'll put resource support. We'll go with that. Because while it was better than the Revolutionary War in terms of what supplies were provided, especially on the Union side, but for both, because they did provide some food to the soldiers and a little bit more clothing, but the reality was that the military on both sides had areas where they were lacking. And so, for example, in the North, clothing became a big issue because, of course, cotton and a lot of the production for clothing was in the South. And so as the war continued, clothing was harder for the North. In the South, they had lots of cotton, but as their economy tanked, food became a significant problem for the South. And so consequently, this ultimately required women to step up and provide resources. So we have, they provided clothing and blankets, quilts and things like that they provided and made for the men. There was a variety of women that provided food. We're going to have nursing, and although we'll talk more about that, how it becomes more official. And then you have some women in the North, and that was only in the North, who fought as men. So in this case, right, that should sound almost identical to what we talked about in the Revolutionary War, and that was. So we're not going to get into talking about the specifics of what some that were camp followers. So that wasn't the title anymore, but you had women, especially poor Southern women and poor women in the North, that could not survive. They went and stayed at the camps, the war camps, with their husband because that was their only option for survival. So like I said, those things all stayed the same. What we're going to look at is we're going to split it up between North and South. Because the experience of women in the North with the Civil War and the experience of women in the South was very different. There's a few overlapping things, but the reality is they just had such different experiences on how that was. And then we'll look at slave women or former slave women and slave women and how they experienced the war. So one of the things that was a big difference right off the bat with Northern women is that you had very early on the creation of the United States Sanitary Commission. And this was definitely a culmination of women in the North already having more experience with organizational communities and programs. So what the United States Sanitary Commission was looking at, it was essentially a support system for the Northern Army, the Union Army. And what they did is they combined local societies to make a national one. And the benefit of this for the North was that it was much more organized and was able to provide supplies right off the bat. And the fact that they were so more organized in that whole system meant that you had this kind of continual supply system and aid that the South was much more haphazard in how they did it, and this was really beneficial to the Union Army. So it was supplies and aid, and what that meant then was that they provided, they wrote speeches and letters, and both of these things were to get supplies donated or money. So supplies donated and money. Women had these letter campaigns, and they had offices, right? So I guess if we could put the Sanitary Commission, that you had offices, and so they had the National United States Sanitary Commission, and then you had local branches. But the point being is that they were still all connected to the main United States Sanitary Commission, and worked as a single group. So local offices. So they actually had offices, which also shows the level of organization, right? This, in the Revolutionary War, people did it in their homes. These women got together and created these groups to fundraise, and it was just done informally in their homes. Now you had actual local offices that were created, and you had women as head of the branches. So that this was all led by women, created by women, led by women, throughout the whole process. So they would write speeches and letters to get supplies donated. They also did fairs, and these fairs were also for money and supplies, where you would go and have there'd be food, or there'd be activities, and you'd buy a ticket, and the ticket would, then that money would all proceeds go to, right, the military. Then you had women that were in charge of the branches, who were responsible for purchasing various items for both the Sanitary Commission office and things that then were getting transferred to the Union Army. They were responsible often for transporting injured soldiers. So if injured soldiers were coming home, or they needed to be moved to a different hospital, the United States Sanitary Commission would often be brought in, and these women would manage that. And then they often organized nurses and set them up in whichever location in their assignment, we'll say. Right, so that you had women. The part of that was putting nurses in areas that were needed, and so this was a massive organization, and very, very impressive in that. So I wanted to show a couple pictures from this, so you can kind of see that structure. Here, they actually had a seal created for it with the United States Sanitary Commission. And this, or their name, was often stamped on. They had official letterhead. They had, when they made quilts, that was usually just the name. But the seal was used to just showcase how official and large this was, right? This was not, I mean, it wasn't a business, but it ran kind of like a business in that aspect. Here you have the Sanitary Commission, which was highlighting women's roles. So what we have, right, is nursing here. This one was looking at, she could also be a nurse, but if you notice, she's reading a book. And now, of course, my computer is deciding to be slow again. And this idea of one of the roles that was emphasized on women, actually both in the North and the South, was this idea of being a mother to the men, and how they could provide comfort, so that they cared for the injured. Besides actual nursing, right, she's reading a book to an injured man, or they'd write letters home to their family. Taking care of the sick. One of the differences, you have nurses here too. This is in a hospital. It's hard to tell on this one, but this is in the field. And you did have women that worked in the hospitals and those that worked in the field that were actually going onto the battlefield or real close to bring them out. Here you have women who are sewing, whether that's clothing or quilts. And then this one is providing aid. And so this was meant to showcase all the different ways that women helped, all the different ways that the Sanitary Commission helped. And of course, women were the ones doing all of these roles. And so they really did advertise and showcase their role. And that was another big difference, right? Is that, the women in the Revolutionary War did a lot of these things. But not the nursing, but the fundraising, the sewing, and provided this important support. And then you had the camp followers that kind of did the informal nursing. But there was no promotion of it. There was definitely this sense and feeling that what women were doing was not only important, but that they wanted to self-promote, to showcase their vital role in the Civil War. And that was definitely a new thing as well, this idea of self-promotion, the importance of putting out there and showcasing what women were doing. One of the fundraisers and there's a lot of these you can find, were these fairs. And so you buy a ticket, and there was a variety of types of fairs. So this one's the Sanitary Fair, Sick and Wounded Soldiers, Grand Soiree and Promenade, Ladies Bazaar, and that's just a sale on the tickets. And so you could have, within these fairs, you could have dancing, food, vendors, Ladies Bazaar selling stuff. You also had speakers that would come talk. It was a variety. The fair was essentially a variety of things, of activities, let's say. And of course, then the money went it was fundraising. These were all fundraising fairs, and the money was to raise money for the Sanitary Commission, which then in turn used that to help and aid the Union Army. And then here is just so this one's the Soldiers' Aid Society, but you can see right above it, U.S. Sanitary Commission. So they had the actual offices, and I think that's, again, important to showcase the fact that this was so much more official. It was so much larger than what we had talked about during the Revolutionary War, and that you had these permanent offices, storefronts, offices, where the organization took place. And you had the main office, which was nationwide. We'll say national. And then you had local offices that were regional, because obviously you needed a kind of starting point to train nurses, to send them out, to take soldiers to, and one location in the north wasn't going to be enough. And so these were all over the place in various states, being there as a provider. Okay, so that's with the United States Sanitary Commission. The other area that, which is connected to the nurses and what the United States Sanitary Commission did, but we're going to look at more specifically, is nursing. Nursing was now officially, we'll say, recognized as acceptable for women. Right, so where it was informal in the Revolutionary War, now women were seen as nurses. That one of the things that it shows us is that this had moved from a male job to a female job. And once women took this over, it remained that way. I mean, you could still look at, there's far more women than men in nursing, but that's only within the last, 5 years that you've seen more men go to nursing school and become nurses, and even not evening out the ratio completely, but making it more acceptable. And that's also something we talked about with jobs, is the fact that when you had this, it's sometimes called the feminization of jobs, or later they were called pink jobs, which was just a title given to it, where you have jobs that become female jobs. They're only for women, because a lot of the times when women began participating in a type of career or job, men moved out of them. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Men moved out of the job because, here, let's put that in there, because it is interesting how, and we'll keep looking at this in a couple different areas. But so when women moved into a job, men moved out. Oh, okay. I might have to pause this here if it's going to keep having that delay. We'll see if it's going to kick back in just a second or not. So why they did this, right? So why? There were a couple of reasons. One was that the money or pay, right? When women took over, it went down, always. The value of that job was always seen as less. And that kind of goes into the second part, which is the, I don't know why you say reputation of the job, the prestige of the job declines. So it was seen as, right, there was definitely this idea that men and women could not do the same job. Well, they could, should not, right? That men could not, certainly that men could not stay in that type of job if women fully took it over. So that's it. There were some where there was a few women that were participating. Like when we look at education in one of the next lectures, there were women who became trained as lawyers, but it was severely limited in what they could do, and that didn't switch over to a female job. But when you have this larger inundation of women coming in and taking over these roles, then the men moved out, and then it was seen like that you would have been criticized, critiqued, made fun, ridiculed if you were a man who stayed in as a nurse when it switched over to women largely doing this job. So there was definitely this ideology that men and women didn't do the same jobs. If women took over, it became classified essentially as a female job, and no longer something that men did. And the consequence of that was that the pay went down and the prestige of the job went down in the process. So thus the feminization of jobs and things like that. So nursing was one of those that now was officially something women could do. There's two people that are significant in this change. You have Clara Burton, and she founded the American Red Cross. So setting up a nursing, it provided aid too, and the American Red Cross becomes important in World War I and World War II as well, and they're super active. And then you have Dorothea Dix, and Dorothea Dix, so with Clara Burton, right here we could put it here, makes it more acceptable. What makes it more the norm, or makes it more acceptable, makes, we'll say helps with the transition to women as nurses. Not only the transition, but making it seem okay, right? That this was not informal. This was officially now women's roles. And then Dorothea Dix, she fought for women to get paid as nurses. So this was extremely important, and both of these were part of that transition to official, as a job that women could do outside of the home. Because now if they got paid as nurses, then it's officially in a job, not just a volunteer thing during times of war. And because of this, nursing then remains something that women can do as a job after the war. She also fought for the specific pay. The northern women got around $12 in pay. And this was a big thing, because the reality is that there was argument about whether or not women should get paid to do this, or whether this was something that should be a volunteer. It was $12 a month, which doesn't sound like a ton, but it was, still decent money for the time for women getting actual paid. And in fact, of course, the other thing that's important about getting paid is that the more jobs that women get paid for in society, the more and more women start having control of that income, even with femme covert still technically being on the books. So when there were less jobs that women got paid for, it was easier for the men to control their wages. As more and more women worked, they ended up getting a lot more control of their wages. Again, femme covert still technically stays on the books as a law and is still used in a variety of practices. And legally, a husband could take that pay and do whatever he wanted with it. But because more and more women were doing this, it became harder to do. And then, of course, you have a lot of unmarried women who weren't doing this once they were married, because that was still a taboo, is that there still was this view of unmarried women as preferred. In some aspects, although Dorothea Dix wanted some very specific things, but unmarried women for work, you could be a widow. There were some women who were married to soldiers that also were part of this. Now, Dorothea Dix, though, however, had some very clear ideas of what she thought women as nurses should be. She required, as part within her nursing, she created like a nursing company, essentially, and then hired them and then deployed them to different areas where they're needed. So they technically worked for her, but were paid by the government. So she wanted women. Unmarried women for work wasn't just Dorothea Dix, right? Because she did hire married women too, but there was in general this we'll say in a lot of fields. Okay, so she wanted women who were plain, when they wanted women to look plain, women who were plain, and then she wanted, they were supposed to dress modestly. And the idea behind this was that, of course, she was fighting, and then this is part personal preference too, but they were fighting this idea of, they're going to seduce the men, or they're going to be too attractive, and that's going to be a problem. So this was meant to be that their focus on nursing, rather than feminine qualities. It was this weird mix of how do you make sure that you try to fight detractors who are saying, the women are just going to seduce the men, or they're there for I don't know what other nefarious purpose it would be. Well, then you say, okay, they're plain, they're just modestly, they're not there to distract the husband. The other reason was because they were supposed to take on, and this gets referenced a lot, a motherly persona. So she did also like hiring older women, not like old women, but like in their 30s, because they were more likely to be seen as a mother than a very young girl. And she didn't hire young girls. You were in your 20s and 30s. And the idea being is that they were to be a motherly persona for the men. And this also then reinforced why it was acceptable for women to be nurses. And so it definitely went to that as well, right? It's connected. This is the easiest way to connect it to the domestic sphere. And so this ultimately then allowed women to be involved in official nursing. So the next aspect in the North that we'll look at is has to do with three different ways. We'll say it's the home front and war. We'll just call it that. I'm just going to combine it because I'm not going to get into too much detail with this, just to make sure it's on the list of what women did. You know, there were women who, you know, took over a farm or business, just like with the deputy husbands during the Revolutionary War. And so you do have a lot of literature and other things, and women writing about their role in having to support the families without the husband, and managing life with that. And so, like I said, I think that's where you see it more, is that there is literature, and it highlighted women's role as solo head of the household. Again, this was temporary. It was not seen as something that was meant to be permanent, but there was way more recognition in the North of that women were taking on, right? They were solo because they were taking on the role of husband as well as their own. So they were still supposed to be a mother and a wife, but without the husband, they were also doing all of those other parts as well. And then you also had women who fought in the war and disguised themselves as men, just like the Revolutionary War. The difference was that some did receive pensions. And that was a lot more difficult for women in the Revolutionary War to be recognized as such. And also women as spies. And spies also were more likely to receive a pension and recognition for their services. The spies, in the same way of women being able to use their femininity to bypass suspicion. Security. So the fact that they could attend parties, write letters. Now, women in the North had a little bit of a harder time than those in the South, I think, of crossing over to the South and not having certain people be suspicious. But if you had some connections, a lot of it was that not so much attending parties in the South, but attending parties and hearing information from other family members. Writing letters was a huge one, where they wrote letters to friends or relatives on the other side, who then shared information, and then they would pass that information by. Definitely, if you lived in a border state, which was close, this was even much easier to move back and forth between. Because again, women were just less suspected of being politically involved. And so then they would pass on information. We'll look at Harriet Tubman, and when we look at Harriet Tubman, we're going to talk about how she was a spy. And that even gave her also the ability of moving back and forth between the two. North and South as a slave, as a pretending to be a slave, and being invisible. But the reality was is that women were just more invisible when it came to the political realm. So much like that. So these, again, we talked about these. These didn't really change from the way that we talked about them in the Revolutionary War. We're going to look at Southern women in just a minute. I'm going to show a few pictures from that, and then we'll look at conditions in the South. So here was with nursing. Again, writing a letter here. So that nurses really had this kind of multifaceted role of caring for the wounded, cleaning the hospital, taking care of bandages, treating patients, but then also being there to comfort them, read them books, have them there to write letters home, be that motherly. It really is that motherly persona. So it wasn't, like I said, it was a very multifaceted expectation of what they did. And then here again, showing the different roles of women in nursing, in comforting, and aiding soldiers, and in sewing, and participating in kind of all those areas. Although you do see that the nursing was highlighted, and that's particularly true, is that there really was this highlight of women as nurses and that importance of that role. Oh, and then I forgot about this one, which was unique. This was not as common, but there were these factories. I'll add it to the list. There were these factories where the military needed production of supplies, and they didn't always. Most of the men were fighting in the war. There ends up being a draft for soldiers. And so women ended up doing some of these factory line work, or factory line kind of, it wasn't actual factory line yet, but this factory work. And in this one, the picture, they're actually filling up cartridges for the gunpowder for the Civil War. They also helped with prepping bullets as well. And this was seen as an acceptable way to aid, which is unusual because it dealt directly with warfare, and weapons, munitions, things like that, which we'll see a tension in World War I and especially World War II of how do you connect that to the domestic sphere. The biggest way they did was just that it was temporary, and it was a need that they didn't have men to do, so women were able to step up and do that. But this was less common than the other ways that we talked about. This is Frances Clayton. She dressed up as a man and kept the name Frances and just changed her last name to fight in the Civil War. And there were several women who did this. And again, this was a northern thing, not a southern thing, because women in the South, that would have, to dress up as a man and disguise yourself to fight would have just been crazy. So you don't see that. We'll see how women get involved in other ways, but fighting as a man was not one of them. But in the North, this was something that there were several women that did this as well. Okay, so let's go back. Let me just add that one. Here, we'll put it under here, war in the home front. Let's say more, we'll just say factory production work. Generally speaking, the two areas that they did were that filling of cartridges for gunpowder, right? Because you needed that prepped if you were going to fire quickly, and then munitions, specifically with the bullets and things like that. So they actually were producing, part of the weapon for the guns. Now with Southern women, and we saw that one right here was, oops, wrong one. A picture of Confederate women next to the flag. Southern women participated as well in a variety of ways, but it was different. Get that one down. One of the key differences is that you did not have a national organization, like in the North. It was much more local based societies, or even at the individual level. So it kind of reflected more with like how the Revolutionary War at the individual level of how women were involved in that process. Women did local fundraising for their town. That was very common. And it was specifically for local soldiers and military units. Rarely did they do larger fundraisers, which was meant to go to all of the Confederate soldiers. Instead of like our boys and this, our boys in this unit, which is they'd often be in the military units, they'd be all from the same town, which was kind of a horrible thing. So the benefit of having soldiers all be in a unit together from a single town is they knew each other, and some of that you could work better together. The horrible aspect of it was if there was, on either side, both sides did this, if there was a catastrophe in terms of battle, like if your unit did poorly, and usually you weren't the only unit fighting, but let's say you were on the losing side of a battle and it was just a really bad loss, there were times where 90% of the boys from that town were dead. And that was devastating to the women, to the children, to the economic aspect of that town, especially after the war, where you had a massive deficit of men in that area after the war. So it definitely could have severe consequences that women had to deal with. That a whole town of women, that essentially you had these towns, there were some in the North and some in the South, more in the South than in the North. Because they had higher losses, but both sides had this happen where you had these towns, especially if they were smaller towns, where most of the unit didn't make it back, and it was the elderly and women and children. And that town looked like a ghost town of men, and women actually, a lot of them, there were two things that happened. Women either moved out and went somewhere else to find men for husbands. You also had a higher percentage of women that then stayed widows or unmarried because there were not men in the town anymore. This gave them more independence and control economically, but it was also devastating to the production of what could be done within the town. And then, of course, just the sheer loss of a town essentially collectively mourning their boys because of that. So that was definitely a downside to putting whole towns in or cities. The cities, you have a bigger population, it was less likely to happen. But in these smaller towns, it happened enough where they lost a lot of their people. So yes, you might fight better and work better together because you know each other, but you're at much higher risk for just destroying a town in the process. There was less, there was not the same organization, so you didn't have no organized nursing. Here, let's put actually as a title, because there's a couple things we want to talk about with nursing. So there were nurses in the South, and that women participated in. You did not have any kind of national nursing organization. Instead, you had women that volunteered initially at hospitals, and you see less field nurses, right, that were near the battlefields. The other thing is that plantation mistresses would volunteer as nurses, and they would help, like cleaning the bandages, reading. So one of the things that so let's put what they did first. They would definitely read and write letters to the men. are for the men. They played a role in providing comfort. They occasionally helped with prepping, we'll say preparing various bandages and supplies. But they also usually brought slave women to do the dirtier aspects of nursing. So then slaves were often the ones that did the cleaning of the the bloody bandages, and occasionally helping the doctors with really like the gory cases. They actually had separate units for the slave women. They were paid. Technically, it was $30 to $40 a month, but this was in Confederate money, so it was not that much, right? It sounds like, whoa, they were paid so much more than the Northern women, but no, when you take in the account the inflation of Confederate money, so we'll put that in Confederate dollars. It was not that much, but the fact that they were paid was a big thing. And technically, we'll put it here, slave women received money, but the caveat being that was given to the plantation mistress, right, given to their owner. And you can guarantee that they did not hand over that money to them. So it was a false payment in that sense. But the fact that they paid them money was a big thing, considering with kind of the roles of Southern women. The other way that nursing took place was kind of unofficially, and we'll say makeshift stations. And there were two things that happened with this. One was in their own home, when the battle spilled into the battle came near to their house. So especially in the South, there were some instances in the North, but as the push for the Union Army further and further south and into the South happened, a lot of women found their plantations and their homes as partial battlefields. And their home not only became a command center sometimes, but then it became a makeshift field hospital. So that's where they worked in the field. They didn't volunteer to go out to the fields, but their homes often became field hospitals. And then they would aid the soldiers or any civilians that were injured that way. Or they would go help, right, if the battle was near their town. And so this was very impromptu. There was no payment. There was no training. It was just in the moment aspect of it. The next thing that we see is that there is this shift to women being more involved, that it forced some political involvement, not in the war itself fully all of the time, but there were two main ways we tended to see this with Northern women, or with Southern women, and the changes. So one is that women, poor women in the South, ended up petitioning the Confederate government to send their husbands back. Because the reality is that the poor women in the South was not prepared to be able to handle any of this, the poor economy or any of that. So the reason for that, right, you ended up with a poor economy as the war continued, and the fact that they really were small farmers, barely getting by with this, just barely getting by before the war, and life was hard before the war, and they didn't have any slaves, right, and no slaves to help with the labor. And so when at the beginning of the war, the South had made a rule that here, what will we put? We'll just put it under here, right? So the South had made a rule that if you were a plantation owner and you had over 100 slaves, then you did not have to be drafted into the war. And the idea with this was that they were more important to these plantation owners to stay at home, because there was an understanding that a fear of that slaves would leave, right? And so one was, okay, so women can take care of the farms or smaller plantations and they can run those. But if we take all of the plantation owners that are the large plantations, then who's going to make sure the slaves don't escape or rebel? And so there was that fear of rebellion. So the problem was, though, that all the wealthy people, the Civil War fighting over slavery, who this benefited was the plantation owners. It did not benefit the poor white Southerners outside of the racial component and maintaining that kind of racist ideology. But economically, socially, in any way, it did not benefit the poor white Southerners. They got nothing out of slavery continuing except for that racial component of superiority. Everything was so entrenched in this ideology of what the plantation owners had created and wrapped the system around themselves that most went and, of course, termed it in Southern rights and things like that. But then you have the plantation owners being told they didn't have to be drafted into war. So only, the smaller plantations or poor white Southern men were drafted into the war. As the war continued and you still saw these men that were wealthy not fighting and their men were dying, their sons and husbands were dying, women got really upset. This ended up, these poor women became very frustrated with this, and they said it's not fair that we're the ones that we can't survive without our husbands, and yet you guys who have enough money are able to, you don't have to go to war. So they wrote up petitions and protested the Confederate government in order to try to have their husbands sent back. And not all, but like the idea of if we're not surviving, then we need to have support and have them come back and help out. That was really like what's important with this, right, is this kind of the first political involvement that we see Southern women participate in. Later, you have in 1863, when conditions had continued to deteriorate and prices and massive inflation, women in Richmond had essentially what was a bread riot, protested, and there was some rioting. They started with protesting first, and the reason for this is that they protested the high cost of food. Whoops, get the T in there. So the high cost of food, and specifically bread, was kind of on the table with that, but it was food in general. And what they wanted is they demanded food, bread and meat specifically, to be able at the same prices that the Confederate armies paid for. They said, we're being upticked money, and the Confederate Army is getting a discount, and that's not fair for survival. Remember, the South, their issue was food. As the war continued, the North, it was clothing. This eventually did lead to some rioting, where they broke, and merchants, well, bakers, stores, and took food. And we'll look more at the conditions in a minute. But again, it's this political aspect and involvement that didn't exist before. Let's look at those pictures real quick. So this one we looked at already. This one, I'll put this down the list too. So this is a cartoon, and it was the art of inspiring courage. And it was seen as women, Southern women, were super gung-ho at the beginning about, especially the wealthy. Okay, so there is a difference here, right? That women encouraged their husbands to go to war, because there definitely was more of this sense of patriotism for the South, of course, and pride, right? And a good Southern woman should be excited about her husband going off and fighting for this war. But then you had a lot of these plantation owners that didn't have to. They avoided the draft. And so there became, and even the sons of the plantation owners avoiding the draft. Essentially, right, it was the South, it was a war that was started by the rich people and for the rich people, and yet the rich people were the ones not fighting it. But there were definitely this sentiment of women having, initially at the beginning of the war, being locked into this fervor of that romanticism of the war. And it definitely was romanticized in the South. Some in the North too, but way, way more in the South was it romanticized. And so you had this cartoon of ways of that women encouraged their men to go to war. I think there was two for men, but you have these four, right? So the first one is how wives make their husbands enlist. Lady, either you or I, sir, right? So she's all dressed up, ready to go to war. And it's either you go or I'm going to go. And of course, that idea with the Southern women as dressing up as men and fighting was like seen as an unacceptable thing for women to do, right? If you debased yourself just by working outside of the home, imagine how you would debase yourself dressing up as a man. But that's how dedicated, I am to this war. So either I'm doing this or you're doing that. Then it's young ladies and their lovers. I'll marry that man tomorrow if you prove a coward. So she's what? Suggesting that she's going to marry this guy instead if he doesn't go to war. How sisters may influence their brothers to resolve to do or die. To think, Gus, that little Captain Bobbins is so much more nobler a man than you. So shame, right? These were threats. Shame. How mothers may arouse the slumbering lion in their son's breast. That's right, Sammy. Trounce him well. Put fish. I guess P-I-S-H, right? Fish. Whatever that sound is. He's only a parlor soldier. So encouraging your son to shame either your husband or another man. And so it was using womanly influence to support the Southern cause in these different ways. And these are conditions, so we'll come back to that one in a minute. Oh, I guess I had this one off a little bit. Well, look, so here's this one. Here was the Southern Women's Bread Riot. One of the things that I think is interesting with this is look at how gaunt their faces are in this depiction. That was a significant issue, is that there were plenty of women starving in the South. So this was a political thing, but it came out of a direct necessity for many women who were starving because they didn't have the funds or the ability. And then here, this is just that romanticized, oh, the title went away, notion of war, right? And the women lovingly looking on and as the husband goes off. And I think that's, yeah, we'll come back to that because we're going to finish talking about those. Okay, so political involvement, we could put that under political involvement, that romanticized, romanticized war and encouraged husbands and brothers to enlist. And there was seen as kind of that this was definitely a woman's duty, a Southern woman's duty, to encourage them to participate in the war. And this was largely for the plantation elite, because they're the ones that could avoid the draft, right? You didn't have to convince the poor white Southerners because they were forced to go with the draft, where there was this main push to say, well, for the plantation elite, we can't force them because of this. Now, eventually they repeal that because they get so desperate, but that's at the tail end of the war. So even before the tail end of the war, they were trying to get Southern women to try to get their husbands to go, even though they technically didn't have to. So conditions for Southern women, this was significantly different than in the North. Because just of kind of how the war went, along with the fact of the plantations and slavery and everything else. So one was with plantations, and the fact that women who had up to this point been, we looked at that, supposed to just be, oops, come back. There we go. All right. I'm going to have to pause this, I think, because it's being weird. So hang on a second. I'm going to fix this. All right. Let's see if this works. So with the plantations, women were now supposed to run them. And so what's interesting with this, right, is that you're going from women who, as I mentioned, were just simply there to be, and at most manage the household slaves, were now expected to run the plantations for those whose husbands left. And now again, this did not include the larger plantations at first, although eventually they will also be required to go help out in many cases, but that becomes a little bit later on the war. But either way, right, you have a couple of things that are happening with this. One is of course that it's a massive thing to do, and so they were kind of thrown into this position that they had almost no experience or education to manage, because of how sheltered they had been, and the South had intentionally established that. On top of that, of course, not surprisingly, slaves began to run away or stop working. And so that was definitely a part of it too, of this that you had lots of slaves leaving, and or just simply refusing to work, and that only increased with the Emancipation Proclamation. So what this ended up doing is that women found themselves for the first time having to do jobs around the house that they had never done before, such as cooking, cleaning. I mean, pretty much everything about taking care of yourself, dressing and hair. Those were things you had personal slaves that did before that. So cooking, cleaning, dressing, hair, educating their children, mothering. How about we just put that? They had to actually be present for their kids. You didn't always have the kids around. So that was one thing that was part of it. The other had to do, of course, with the increasing economic problem that took place. Oh, and for some women, as slaves began to leave or stop working, begged some of their slaves to stay. And this, often what they would do is that they would offer money. They offered to, so even before the Emancipation Proclamation, but again, after as well, they offered to pay them. This tended to be focused on cooks and in general household slaves. Although cooks were if you look at letters, cooks tended to be the biggest in demand. Household slaves, the only other one that was up there was struggling to write here. There we go. The only other one that tended to be first, that was for, most of those were women, female slaves. You did have, and so like those that were raising the kids, and then cooks tended to be the number one thing, but you also had what were specialized skills, slaves with specialized skills, whether that was someone who was a carpenter or someone who helped manage part of the plantation. Those were the slaves that they were less interested as things got more dire in keeping the plantation running, as just the general household, although some were hoping to try to keep the plantation running by encouraging and paying some slaves to help keep the other slaves working. That this was done, but was not usually successful. Not surprisingly, most slaves said, yeah, no thanks, we're good. As the economy got worse and in conditions, women also found themselves not having enough money to buy things. And both because of the price of cotton tanked and the inflation of the Confederate dollar. And so they found themselves having to get outside jobs. For some women, there was mixed reactions to this. All right, so some women actually wrote letters to families and friends and were happy about it because they could actually do it without being ostracized. And then others lamented the change. There was one letter where the woman wrote, and I think I mentioned this one, but like before when we were talking about just plantation mistresses, there was one woman that wrote her friend and was basically like, thank God I can finally go do something, work outside of the home and not be ostracized from it. I've been so freaking bored. She didn't say freaking, but like that idea, because there was, if you were educated, if you were interested in expanding yourself at all, that really wasn't an option for most women unless your father or really your father initially and then your husband encouraged it, and that was few and far between. And you couldn't go get a job because that was seen as debasing yourself. And so for some women, they were, life as a plantation mistress could be incredibly boring. And this was an opportunity to do that and not be ostracized from society. Other women wrote how horrible it was, and they couldn't believe that they were having to debase themselves. So there was no consensus on that. But it was something that women did go outside of the home to work for survival. Because things got really bad in condition-wise for food, like we saw with the riots, for bread and meat. And just, it took like a barrel full of Confederate money to be able to buy a loaf of bread. So it just got ridiculous, and most people didn't have that money, let alone like with the poorer women's conditions who were literally starving because of the conditions. The other thing that women ended up doing was, I guess, being creative with what they had. So women wrote about making clothing from curtains and sandals from a doormat. And being proud about that, and having to learn these type of things that they didn't have to before. In general, other conditions that definitely took place is that whole towns were destroyed from warfare. And that certainly created a different experience. So one that is with Sherman's March. Sherman's March was a northern plan with General Sherman, and the purpose was, this was total warfare. And so what total warfare means is that it involves civilians. You use civilians or civilian targets as part of the war. And so the goal was to march south towards Charleston and the sea. And they were going to eventually meet up with naval battle and just dominate that area and take out part of the South. It was part of a two-front war. So you had Grant, who was doing one part, and Sherman, who was doing another. And this was a massive northern push. How it worked is that their soldiers, in order to move quickly, brought very few supplies. And what they would do instead is that they would take food and supplies from southern homes. And then I'll explain more about that in just a second. They would also destroy anything of value, both publicly and privately, that could help the Southern cause. So they both public and private. So what they would do is they would tear up. They were called Sherman's bow ties, and they would tear up and destroy the railroads. They would destroy buildings that could be used for any type of benefit to the Confederate Army. They would destroy stores and food. They would, as far as in the homes, so they'd go to these homes, and the women and children were there, right? Their husbands and fathers were fighting in the Confederate Army. And they would ransack the house. They would take any food they found, as much of the food they could. They would take any cattle or animals that were farm animals that they could eat later, And anything they didn't take, and then they would also just take whatever else they felt like. Anything that they couldn't take with them, they killed. Not the people. There were strict orders not to kill the people. There were also strict orders not to rape or molest the women. Molest, and I meant the word molest is bother, right? Not like the rape and molesting is obviously one part, but then molesting is also like bothering the women. So they were not supposed to touch the women and children. It did happen. There were women who were raped as Sherman's march made its way to the sea. It wasn't as prevalent or common as it could have been if that directive was not in place, but it did happen. Women are always victims of that in times of war. It just inevitably happens. But again, it could have been a lot more widespread if there wasn't explicit directions to not do that. And most followed that, but you do have stories of it happening sometimes. Besides that, though, their main goal, so they weren't supposed to touch the women and children, but they would go into their home forcibly. They would ransack the house, take whatever they wanted, including just random personal things, but their main focus was food and supplies that were necessary for the supply train of the army. And then again, the farm animals for food for themselves. And then what they would do is they would shoot the remaining cattle or sheep or whatever. If there were any farm animals, they would torch any fields. So if you had a small family farm and you were planting food, they would torch that as well. And then they would leave. Okay, so why do this? The purpose was specifically to, it was to cut off supplies to the South. But you don't just, and this is for total war in general, but specifically for Sherman's march, the other purpose was not just to cut off supplies. Certainly when they were destroying the railroads and anything that could be used for the army, that was to cut off their supplies, and that was targeted at the military. But why go into people's civilians' homes, women and children, and ransack and take all their food and destroy their farm or cattle? Well, because the idea was to have civilian pressure to end the war. And it worked. Because you had women writing their husbands and pressing the Confederate government. You guys aren't protecting us. We are devastated here. This needs to stop. And so in that case, it worked. Of course, what was difficult for women then with this was that, a loss of food and livelihood, because the reality is, not just livelihood, because it wasn't but food and the ability, we'll say, to survive on their own. Everything, in some cases, everything was devastated. If your house, they didn't burn down the houses usually, but they took everything. So you didn't have food from your farm, or you didn't have the cattle for money. Your food in your house was taken directly from you. Clothes, sometimes just to be spiteful, but also other items and goods in the house could be taken. They weren't against occasionally destroying tables or furniture or other things like that. And so it made it difficult to survive. And of course, there was an added component of fear, of fear, especially as it became known, of women who were not yet attacked, but were aware that it could potentially come. Some women did fight back, if you will, where what they did is they created secret hiding places, and they stored grain and other foods, so that even when the soldiers came, they didn't take everything. And that was one way to fight back and try to just protect, because really this came down to, whether South or North, right, protecting their lives and their children's lives, and making sure that they didn't starve to death. So storing food and items. The other thing they would do is that they created a network of network or system of alert. And so what this did is that that they would send riders when the Sherman's army was seen to warn women and children, so that they would have time to do more. Right now, what these women started doing as this became known is, like I said, they were storing stuff permanently in these hiding spots. But then they would also secret away other things. The other thing they started doing was transferring. If you had a farm and things were planted, there's not much you could do. Cattle around. But if you had, like I said, farm animals, what you could do is transfer them to other homes that were not directly in the path of Sherman's march. And then so you get the warning or early alert system. You would transfer, not all, because if all of it was gone, it would look suspicious, but you transfer some of your cattle or your animals, some of your extra goods that maybe you couldn't hide in the hiding spots. And then it would go far enough away that it wasn't in the path of Sherman's march, and then you would go retrieve it after they left. This didn't stop everything. There were some women that lost everything, but that was something that they had to deal with that was incredibly devastating. Besides Sherman's march, so that was A, you also had, of course, the fact that many towns and cities in the South became directly in the path of fighting. And if you look at I didn't put one of these pictures, but if you look at Google, like southern towns after Civil War battle or something like that, you can see the devastation. There were some towns that were completely destroyed. And the level of destruction almost looks like World War II destruction with the bombing campaigns. And because they were completely destroyed during the battles, many women had to hide, and children hid in caves, if there were caves, outside of town, away from the fighting during the battles. So you definitely had a level of experience of war and that fear of immediate threat from the actual battles that many women in the North didn't experience because of the devastation. And then, of course, that this devastation led to more primitive basic living conditions, right? That where they found their home was destroyed, the whole town was destroyed, and so having to how to feed and clothe children when you had nothing, and when you had nothing left. All right, we're going to show a couple more pictures, and then we're going to talk about African American women and the Civil War. All right, so for here, oh, and I didn't talk about spies. This was a Confederate spy, and while she was in prison, and her daughter was visiting. I thought I had, oh, here it is. I was like, I had one more. It was just out of place. This is hard to see because the drawing is really light, but this is the woman and her child. There's the kid, there's the woman, and these are Union soldiers. And this was during Sherman's march. And so it shows, right, that the invasion into their home, ransacking and taking everything, and having to deal with that. But women in the South were also spies. and wrote letters to many people, and letters were a very common way of where they got information and then passed it on to Confederate soldiers. Okay, so that's for the South, Southern women, like the plantation, the white women. So what's this was not just in the South for African American women, but was part of that. Sorry, I keep going back. E. Oh. Okay, for African American women, you have many who continued to help with both the Underground Railroad and escaped slaves. So, of course, the Underground Railroad started before the Civil War, but it continued for part of the Civil War until it became, with the Emancipation Proclamation, easier and easier to expand, and escaped slaves. And so many free black women in the North, so this is women in the North, right, helped in the South. And continued to be a huge part of that, especially as the numbers increased. There was definitely a need for that. Black women also raised funds and supplies for the Union Army. And specifically for once the North allowed black soldiers to be in the army, they took up supplies and stuff for the Black Union Army, which later developed. And this was often necessary because they were definitely in need of more supplies. And so they formed their own group. It wasn't an official sanitation one, for fundraising food and clothing, especially as the Black Union unit was not as well supplied as the rest of the military. You also had more camp followers with the Black Union Army because of the need that they couldn't survive if their husband wasn't there working, and for some, just the desire to stay together as a family, because this was something that many had to decide whether keeping the family together or fighting for freedom and which to do. And for some it was, well, we're going to do the camp following. Others who could afford to survive with their husband gone usually stayed at home. So that still stayed pretty consistent. You did have nurses in the North, and there were two, then this started from the beginning, that were around, and they usually did, so before you had the Black Union military or army, the black soldiers, then they tended to do more of the cleaning and prep work. Once you had the Black Union unit, then you also had, and units that developed from that, you had them work in hospitals, but in segregated sections. And of course, they only were nurses to black soldiers most of the time. They were paid $10 a month, so they were paid $2 less than the white nurses, and so that definitely still again shows the North, as much as they were fighting against slavery and had the abolition movement, that racism was still something that was prevalent, and even in the North. I mean, in the fact that they had the segregated units and they could only work on black soldiers too. There was some issues of violence on the home front that the free black women in the North had to deal with. And this, the probably the most known case or large case that took place had to do with conscription. So what was going on was that there was the Conscription Act, which said that if you could pay $300, you avoided conscription. So this was a lot of money back then. This obviously was for wealthy families. This led to mob, we'll just say riots and attacks. At first, riots and mob groups. At first, it attacked, they were looking for the wealthy sons, wealthy men who paid to avoid it. However, and there was lots of destruction of property. This bled over into blaming other groups of people, which included African Americans. So their anger shifted to African Americans, and they began moving down into areas in town that was largely black communities, and they continued to destroy their property. And you had essentially blaming them, right, for the war, that we're fighting this war because of you, and they destroyed homes and attacked people on the street, including women. One woman, Adelaide Butler, she was in charge of the orphanage for black children, and she raced over to the orphanage when the mob riots began to move in their direction, and saved over 200 children, sneaking them out of the orphanage as the orphanage was burned down. So this went on for several days. The other thing with just other violence was just day-to-day violence that did take place, targeting basically any black men or women. And that the mob thing was much more destructive, but you still had women who were attacked, who were verbally abused and assaulted. So that was something that they had to deal with as well. Let's look at Harriet Tubman. So we already talked about her work in the Underground Railroad, but she also actually started as a nurse for former slaves, helping them as they escaped. And then when the first black unit and black soldiers were allowed into the Union Army, she moved to being a nurse for them. However, she also realized that she could be more helpful as a spy for the Union Army. She talked to one of the generals and said that she has the ability, which she already had a skill for, of going into the South and not being noticed, right? And she had plenty of practice for that with the Underground Railroad, disguises, of blending in, right? She would be just seen as any other slave, and that she could get information from various plantations, and or as well as anyone that the North had in the South. And so she ended up providing the North with a ton of information about Southern troops, what she observed, what she heard from other plantations. She was an extremely vital source of information. One of the things that information that she gave out was where she figured out where the mines were on one of the rivers. And so she ends up leading her own regiment of 150 black soldiers into the South. And this was connected to that of figuring out where the mines, because the South had laid all these landmines, or water mines, I guess, in the rivers, so that the Union ships couldn't come in without knowing where they were, or you would get blown up. And so she had a detailed map of that, and then led them in 1863. They sailed to South Carolina with her in charge, which was a huge thing for being a woman, let alone black. The South Carolina River, sorry. I said South Carolina, but it's the river, to cut enemy supply lines. But it was the only way they could have done that was with her knowledge of the mines. And then what they did while they cut off supply lines is that they seized food and supplies everywhere they went. And the goal was also to create general unrest and encouraged slaves to leave when they came across the plantations along the river. And they ended up having over 800 slaves go to the Union gunboats that she helped free. Encouraged slaves to leave along river plantations. And of course, the goal with that was to create chaos and a stopping of the more slaves you could get to stop working, the less economic productivity and success for the South. Escaped to Union gunboats. And okay, so that's with Harriet Tubman. I mean, she was just impressive all around. And then she, she did not get any pay for this job, even though she technically was leading part of the military, or pension. And she continued to do work for creating a community for former slaves and helping them start their life after the war as well. All the while struggling to manage after her husband was killed, was murdered, and by a white man after the war, and struggling to manage. She ended up moving in with one of the communities that she established. So she definitely was not recognized for the crazy, amazing person she was at the time, because her story is just insane with what she did and all that she accomplished. Now, for slaves, right, there were a couple different experiences. One, with the chaos of war, it was easier for women than ever before to run away, to escape with their children. Whether that was because the men were now gone and only the women were in charge of the plantation, just the chaos of the war itself. And then as the news of the Emancipation Proclamation spread through the South, you also had women just stop working. So even if they didn't run away, they left or stopped working. So you had this period of uncertainty for what was going on. Even before the war ended, women who did leave that had family members that had been sold began searching for family members. Those children, husbands that had been sold to different plantations. You also had other women who left and took horses. So when women left, they often would take horses or clothing or items with them as they left. And many slave owners were surprised that their slaves ran away. In fact, we have letters of women writing to each other being like, I don't understand why they left, and they stole from us. Like, we treated them well. Why would they leave? And that was definitely that paternalism and that myth that the South had sent, suggesting that women or slaves were happy if you treated them well. And there were definitely women who, like I said, sent letters to former slaves that had escaped and saying, can you please come back and cook for us? We'll pay you. And not surprisingly, the women wrote back and were like, no. But you get this very clear reaction from the Southern plantation mistresses who are like, I don't understand, how could they do this? And that definitely shows that they bought into that ideology that slaves were happy as long as they were treated well, which of course was relative as it was anyway. And then you also had slave women that were forced to be nurses by the plantation mistresses. And we kind of mentioned this with right, for the Confederate Army. So they took them to the hospitals, and they were the ones that did all of the cleaning and the more difficult and what would be considered dirty work, right? The things that had blood on it, helping with the worst injured, because the plantation mistresses weren't going to do it. And they, most likely did not see the money, even though technically they were paid for their work. So really what you see with women was an immediate attempt to find family members and escape or stop working and utilize and exercise their freedom as soon as there was an opportunity to. And where usually women and children as slaves didn't have that opportunity before in the past, they now did, and there were certainly benefits to the men being gone, because a lot of the overseers, the plantation owners were gone. You did have a decrease in sexual abuse during that time. Not that it stopped, it definitely did not, but that threat and fear was often not really able to be put forth on them because of just the sheer lack of number and people or those around that had previously been able to perpetuate that. So it did create this period of opportunity for women to exercise a little more freedom, to not being quite as much fear, and then use that to escape and gain their freedom in the process. Okay, that's where we're going to stop for today. We're going to look at Reconstruction next.